What is it that lives in the body that history never spoke about out loud? That's the question we carry into every episode. Hello, my soul family. I'm Afi G. Come right in. Welcome back to I Am Afi G. What we carry. Conversations on lineage, shadow work, and ancestral healing. If this is your first episode, welcome. You don't need to have listened to episode 1 to receive what we're going to do today. But if you haven't heard it yet, I want to invite you back to it after this one because it lays a foundation for everything we build in this season. Okay, so as I record this episode, I'm realizing I forgot to share my deep and my profound and sincere excitement about being able to introduce myself, or for some of you, reintroduce myself in this space. Though it is true that today practically anyone can have a podcast, I need you to know it's taken me years to get to this point, to this level of intimacy with the public. I wouldn't call it lack of self-trust, but definitely a result of years of carefully working through and working past what has always held me back from doing more. My need for perfectionism. Yes. I'm not going to say to you that I am a recovering perfectionist, but I no longer allow it to hold me back and restrict my growth. As a matter of fact, speaking of perfectionism is one of the most disguised forms of shadow expression. Most shadow content announces itself as something we are ashamed of. Perfectionism, on the other hand, it does the opposite. It dresses up as virtue, high standards, excellence, discipline. We say things such as, I just care about doing it right. That costume is precisely the tell. The shadow doesn't only hold what we've buried because it's ugly. It holds what we've buried because it was unsafe to be. Perfectionism is the armor. The disowned material is underneath it. But more on perfectionism and my experience with it in a future podcast. All I want to say is that I am so happy and overjoyed to be here with you on this platform. Many of you listening right now have been with me for a long time as I slowly grew my following on Instagram and on YouTube. And now we're here. So thank you. May we continue to grow together. Okay, my soul family. Today we go deep. In episode 1, I introduce you to my 3 terms of shadow, my 3 shadows: the ancestral shadow, the compressed shadow, and the sediment shadow. I gave you the names and a brief description, but today I want to dive deep into the teaching of each of these shadows. It is definitely my intent, my prayer, that by the time this episode ends, you will at least have a framework, a real usable framework for understanding what you've been carrying, not just intellectually, but in your body, in your patterns, in the places you've been trying to get to for years without knowing what you were really looking for. At least in this episode, we lay the foundation in our understanding of self. But before we begin, I want to say something. In my years of doing this work, sitting with people in healing sessions, facilitating circles, and as of recent, presenting in clinical and community spaces. There is a particular moment I have witnessed countless of times. It happens when someone hears this framework for the first time. I notice their face changes. Something in the body seems to relax. And what I see in that moment is not confusion. It is not overwhelm. It is recognition. It is the face of someone who, for the first time, does not feel crazy, does not feel like the oddball of the world. It is the face that says, finally, there is a space for me in this universe, in this world. I want that for you today. At least that's definitely my intent. That is my honest goal. So let's dive into it. The first shadow. The first shadow I mentioned in the previous episode is the ancestral shadow. So the ancestral shadow is what your lineage, the lineage you come from, couldn't finish. That is the pain it never processed, the trauma it never resolved, the grief it never got to set down. And it doesn't reach you as a story you were told. It reaches you as a pattern you repeat, a reflex you didn't choose, a posture your body settled into long before you had the words to name it. I want you to understand something fundamental about how ancestral pain actually travels. It does not travel the way we imagine it does. We think of inheritance as something we're told. A family story, a conversation at the dinner table, something passed down in words. But most ancestral pain never got words. It never had that opportunity. It traveled in silence. It traveled in the body, in behavior, in the emotional atmosphere of the homes we grew up in. Epigenetics states this: the study of how experience marks our biology. And it's finally catching up to what African and Afro-Diasporic traditions never doubted: that what our ancestors lived through gets written into the body and carried forward across generations. The displacement your grandparents endured, the violence, the rupture, the sheer work of surviving. None of that stayed sealed inside them. It moved. It moved into your parents, and it moved into you. But here's what I need you to hold alongside the science. As I stated in episode 1, the ancestors are not behind us. They are inside us. And the ancestral shadow is not punishment. It is an undelivered message, let's say. Something your lineage has been trying to complete through you. So, my soul family, how do you recognize the ancestral shadow in your own life? Well, you recognize it in the patterns that feel older than you. You recognize it in the emotional reactions that seem to be way too large for the moment they are responding to. The way certain topics have always been off limits in your family. Not because anyone decided they would be, but because the silence around them had its own gravity. You recognize it in the ways your body responds before your mind can catch up. You recognize it in the tightening in the chest when you find yourself in certain situations, in certain places, interacting with certain people, a sudden desire to disappear. You recognize it also in a rage that arrives before you even know why. These are not character flaws, as many would say and think. These are not signs that something is wrong with you. These are the ancestral shadow speaking. And a shadow, when we finally turn toward it, when it is named and witnessed, begins to transform. Before I introduce the second shadow, the one I believe is the most misunderstood, I want to give you the third one first, because understanding the third will help the second land with its full weight. The third shadow is the sediment shadow. Let me give you a brief visual. I want you to think of sediment in water. Over time, when water is disturbed, either by movement, by disruption, or by force, particles sink to the bottom, right? They accumulate, they compact, and eventually they become the floor of whatever container they've settled in. Well, the sediment shadow is exactly this. It is the oldest, densest layer of what has gone unnamed across generations. It is the material that settled at the bottom of your lineage before no one, not your parents, not their parents, not the generations before them, ever had the space, the safety, or the language to look at it. The sediment shadow is not always visible. That is what makes it so powerful. It does not announce itself. It does not come with a story attached to it. It simply sits beneath everything, beneath the ancestral shadow and beneath the compressed shadow, as the foundation of patterns so deep that the people carrying them don't even know they're carrying them at all. This is like having a problem and not knowing you have a problem. For communities, hear me out, shaped by the Middle Passage, by colonization, by forced migration, by the systematic rupture of family and culture, the sediment shadow runs extraordinarily deep because the disruptions were not one generation deep. They were centuries deep, and centuries of unprocessed pain compacted layer upon layer becomes the ground that every subsequent generation stands on without knowing it. You did not create the sediment shadow, but guess what? You sure are standing on it, and you cannot build something new on ground you haven't examined, on ground you have ignored, on ground that has been tucked away. The sediment shadow has a request. It asks us to go further back than we are comfortable going, further back than memory, further back than family stories. It acts as we give ourselves permission to go into the body, into the bone, into what the lineage deposited long before any of us arrived. That is the work. And it is not for the faint of heart, if I may say so. Listen, true healing requires we steer away from what I often call selective healing, which is not true healing at all. If we are truthfully invested in our own healing, we can't pick and choose the parts of us we want to address and heal, while ignoring the other parts that also contribute to the breakdowns and chaos present in our life. Do you hear me? We must address it. And is it possible? Is healing sincerely possible? Because many of you ask yourself, is healing even possible? Many of you don't even believe that you can actually achieve healing. The answer is yes, it is possible, but we must address it. And that is what we do here. Now, let's talk about the second shadow, the one I skipped over intentionally. The one I believe is the most misunderstood, the one that hides in plain sight, the compressed shadow. This particular shadow is what happens when the inherited pain, the inherited wound, the burden, the inherited grief of the ancestral shadow, all that lineage pain, all those unspoken patterns collides with your own lived experience. And it gets pressed further down by the weight of having to what? Having to survive. That good old survival mode. It is the grief you couldn't afford to feel because there was no one to hold it with you. The anger you were taught was dangerous to yourself or to others. It is the tenderness, meaning the vulnerability or the need, the longing, the grief that had nowhere to land. The needs that you learned early to stop having because having needs created problems. Does this sound familiar to you? The compressed shadow is what I mean when I say people spend years, sometimes decades, training themselves to see their own life as a burden, as a mistake. They move through the world under the disguise of someone who is simply doomed. And what makes it so insidious, what makes it the most misunderstood of the three shadows, is that these people often believe they know themselves deeply because they have been living inside the compressed shadow for so long that it has become the lens through which they see themselves, including themselves in experiences, in relationships, in loss, in goal setting, but through the lens of what has been passed down. And they think they know themselves, but they don't. Because the compressed shadow has taken possession of their mind, their decisions, how they see themselves, how they feel about the world, what they think people think about them. Do you hear me? They think this is just who I am. But it isn't who they are, is it? It is what was compressed into them. Allow me to share with you something personal, which is not something I often do. It took me, I don't know how many years, real years, to learn how to ask for help. And even today, I can admit this to you. It is still not the easiest thing for me to do, but I can do it more openly than before, at least, more willingly, and only with people I trust, which is a whole other conversation. the freedom to even allow myself to trust people, that has been its own excavation because a lack of trust runs through my DNA, as it does in my professional experience through the DNA of Black, Afro-Diasporic, and Latino communities who were given every historical reason not to trust. And I want to go deeper than just what our immediate ancestors passed forward, because the historical and spiritual truth runs much further back than that. We can trace this epigenetically and spiritually all the way back to our enslaved ancestors. And what we fail to see, what gets lost when we only look at our parents and our grandparents, is the enormous cost that trust came attached to for the people who came before them. For our enslaved ancestors, the act of trusting was not a vulnerability. It was a life or death calculation. To trust the wrong person, to ask for help from the wrong person, could mean one of two things. Either I own your life now, or it would literally cost them their life. That is not a metaphor. That is history. And that history did not disappear when slavery ended. It went into the body. It went into the DNA. It became the operating system that every subsequent generation inherited. The deep cellular knowing that vulnerability is dangerous, that needing help makes you a target, that asking is a form of exposure. So when I tell you that I spent years unable to ask for help, I am not just telling you about my childhood or my father or his father. I am telling you about a wound that is centuries old, a compressed shadow that has been pressing down on our communities since before any of us were born. And that depth of understanding is why this work requires more than just therapy, more than positive thinking, more than pulling yourself up. It requires ancestral healing. It requires going back far enough to touch the original wound, because that is where the compression began. Do you hear me now? In a future episode, I will do my best to dissect the unfounded notion, or better yet, I will clarify and demystify the fear behind the word ancestors and how connected we still are to them. Because over the years, the conversation around ancestors, ancestral elevation, and ancestral healing has been deeply condemned, unfairly judged, criticized, demonized, and crucified by the very people who taught us Black, Afro-Diasporic, and Latino communities to sever ties and sever our connection to our roots. And in doing so, in successfully separating us from what was integral to our existence, we also lost our connection to those who came before us by condemning it and calling it evil. So stay tuned for that conversation because it's definitely coming and it's much needed. But I want to stay with the asking for help topic. The inability to ask for help. The once upon a time inability that I lived inside for so many years. came at a high price. I have lost opportunities because I chose not to ask for help. Because somewhere in my formation, asking for help was modeled to me as weakness, as something that would make me less of a man, less intelligent, less worthy, or would bind me to someone else's mercy. Or for us Latinos, what many Hispanic parents and grandparents would say was, después le van a tener que estar debiendo a la gente para siempre. Meaning, in English, you will then have to be owing people forever for what they did for you. And I want to name this specifically because I think it needs to be said out loud in a space like this. This is a wound that runs especially deep in us, in Black man and Latino man. The compression of need, the compression of vulnerability, the training from the time we are boys to equate asking for help with failure. That is not weakness. That is a compressed shadow that was passed to us through the men who raised us, who received it from the men who raised them, who received it from generations of men who had to be invulnerable to survive, who had to compress everything soft in them because the world punished softness in Black and brown men without mercy. And for those of us who grew up in a single parent home with our mothers, like I did, she too taught us how to not ask for help because she too has been trained by the masculine energy she's had to vibrate under in order to what? Survive. The compression was a survival strategy. I want to honor that. Our fathers and grandfathers did what they had to do. But survival strategies that were necessary then can become prisons now. I had to dive deep into my own shadow to uproot the discomfort of asking for help, to retrain myself not to see it as something that would diminish me. That work was not quick, okay? It was not comfortable. And guess what? It is not finished, not fully. But it is work. And it is possible. And that is why I am here. That story, my story, is a compressed shadow made visible. The inherited message that need is weakness. The lived experience of a world that reinforced that message. The compression of everything vulnerable in me, pressed down layer by layer until asking for help felt like a threat to my own identity. What is yours? What is yours? What is your compressed shadow? What was compressed in you so long ago, so quietly, that you now mistake it for your own character, for your own identity? I want you to sit with that. I want you to sit with that because we will come back to it. Okay. I want to bring all three shadows together now, not as separate concepts, but as a living system, because that is what they are. They do not operate in isolation. They operate in relationship with each other, layered, interwoven, each one affecting how the others show up. The sediment shadow is the foundation, the oldest, densest, most invisible layer. Centuries of unprocessed ancestral material compacted beneath everything. The ancestral shadow is what rises from that foundation. The specific patterns, reflexes, and inherited wounds that your particular lineage passed forward. The silence around certain emotions, the way love was or wasn't available, the survival postures that became personality traits. And the compressed shadow is what happens when all of that meets you, your specific life, your specific experiences, your specific moments of pain and survival, and gets pressed further inward by the weight of having to keep moving. What's the message here? The message is you are not broken. You are compressed. And compression is not permanent. It is the nature of shadow work to bring what has been pressed down back into the light. Slowly, safely, with the right support. Do you hear me? I want you to leave this episode with one question to carry into your weeks to come until the next episode. Something for you to analyze, just a question to hold, likely with curiosity, no judgment. And the question is this: what in me feels so old, so familiar, that I have stopped questioning whether it belongs to me or not? Or what in me feels so old, so familiar, that I have never questioned it before today? That is the entry point. That is the entry point. That is where the shadow work begins. Not in crisis, not in drama, not in trying to fight your ex-boyfriend's current partner because you believe she stole him from you. The shadow work begins in that quiet, honest question, asked with the willingness to hear what comes back. Okay, my soul family. We are now 2 episodes into what we carry, and we are just beginning. In the episodes ahead, we are going to move from naming these shadows into feeling them in the body, in relationship, in the places they actually live. We will talk about what the body remembers when the mind forgets. We will go deep into the mother wound and the father wound, not as wounds to be mourned, but as lineage material to be metabolized. We will also talk about the relational cost of doing this work and why it is worth it. And we will talk about what it means to reclaim your cultural identity, not as nostalgia, but as an act of healing. If you're doing this work at a deeper level, if you want community, live gatherings, monthly teaching sessions, and a space to process what these episodes stir up, I want to invite you into the Shadow and Lineage Healing Circle. It is my membership community. I founded for exactly this work. The link is in the show notes and in my bio. Subscribe wherever you listen. Share this episode with someone in your lineage, blood or chosen, who has been carrying something they don't have the language for. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. If something in these 2 episodes has moved something in you, leave a review. It takes just 2 minutes and it helps this work find the people who need it most. And if episode 1 is still waiting for you, it's right there. Go back. Start at the beginning. This work deserves to be received in sequence. My soul family, you showed up, and that matters more than you know. May what was spoken today find the place in you that has been waiting to receive it. May it travel down past the mind, into the body, into the marrow, where the lineage lives. To the ancestral shadow, we see you. To the sediment shadow, we honor you. To the compressed shadow, we are coming for you with compassion, not condemnation. I am Afi G, and this has been What We Carry. Ashe.